Does the perfect exposure actually exist, and does it even matter? Spoiler alert, no it doesn't. Listening to all the advice about mastering exposure will quickly make your head spin, and you may ask yourself, am I missing some magical trick here? But the truth is, you or I are very limited in what we can do with our cameras in the field, and there's definitely no magic going on. Yet there's one thing that no one talks about that will actually ensure that you get the perfect exposure every single time in all your photos. I'm Jan Wegener, and for over 20 years I've dedicated myself to capturing unique bird photos and videos and helping others just like you to create your own masterpieces. The other day I read a comment on one of my photos on Instagram. Wow Jan, magical exposure, how did you do that? And it got me thinking, why is the perfect exposure treated like such a mystical, impossible to achieve thing, when in reality, there's a lot of other factors that play a much bigger role in achieving the results that we're after? What we ultimately refer to as the perfect exposure are stunning images with great details and beautiful overall look and feel. Exposing our images correctly is part of that equation, but we need to follow a few more steps to get great final photos. When we're out and about photographing in the field, all we can really do is damage control, capturing a raw file that has the maximum dynamic range and great detail to work with later. And the key here is to avoid to expose either too dark or too bright. It's as simple as that. And to do that, I like to follow 3 simple steps. Firstly, we need to get the best possible light on our subject. The greater the dynamic range is in our images, the harder it is to find the correct exposure. For instance, if we can, I like to avoid harsh shadows, mottled light, or very harsh sunlight on my subject. So the better the light, the easier it will be for you to get nicely exposed images. And to get the best possible light on our subject, we also need to position ourselves well in the field, and that is my second step. And here I have an extra tip for you. If possible, I like to align myself with my subject in a way that I have a similar brightness on my subject and my background. And that helps me a lot to expose the images properly. Because if you have a big difference like a bright background and a dark subject or vice versa, it is a lot more difficult to achieve the perfect exposure, and these crazy dynamic range differences is really what gives us the biggest trouble in the field. And lastly, step number 3 is to dial in good camera settings. And here we have aperture, ISO and shutter speed available. And what I try to achieve is to shoot at the lowest possible ISO while maintaining a sufficient shutter speed of at least a 400th of a second for perch birds, and also choosing an aperture that is ideally slightly stopped down for increased sharpness and depth of field. But how do we actually know what are good settings, or how do we expose properly in the field? And this is where our histogram comes in, because that shows us how bright or dark our image actually is. And what we want to achieve here is to push the histogram as far to the right as possible without touching the right hand side of the histogram, because that would mean that we're clipping some highlights and losing details in the image, and that's not what we want. And now you might wonder, how can we actually push that histogram to the right side? And it's very simple. We either have to increase our ISO, slow down our shutter speed, or open up our aperture. And here I got another tip for you. Sometimes it's not easy to see on a histogram if you're already losing details in the bright areas or not, and then turning on the highlight alerts or blinkies on your camera can help you tremendously, because the highlight alert will show you on the back of the camera what areas are about to lose detail or are losing detail, and then you can adjust your settings accordingly. And if you're a Sony shooter, you can actually also turn on the in-camera zebras in photo mode, and then you will have these little lines going through any areas that might be too bright and are at the risk of losing detail or being overexposed. As you can see, no matter how hard we try, there's not all that much we can do in the field. If we're positioned in the best possible spot with the best possible light on the subject, dialing good camera settings while watching the histogram, we've essentially exhausted all our weapons in the arsenal, and there's nothing else we can do to achieve great exposure in the field, at least when photographing wildlife. Yet on many occasions you will find that your images will actually still look pretty terrible. And that is because it's simply impossible to get it right in camera when one of the 3 inputs, light, positioning or camera settings, are out of balance. And because we're dealing with nature here, and nature isn't perfect, this essentially happens almost all the time. So in these cases we have to just do our best in the field to get the closest to the perfect exposure or balanced exposure as possible, and then deal with the rest later to make it look perfect in our final images. And this common bronze wing here would be a great example. The exposure overall is as good as I can get it in the field, but there's actually too much light on the subject and not enough light on the background. So the overall image actually looks really unbalanced, even though exposure-wise, I did everything I could in the field. So what can we actually do to get the perfect exposure and balance in all of our images? Step number 1 is to try to create as much of a perfect or balanced exposure in the field as possible, where we have a raw file with maximum detail and dynamic range available. But that is only the first step. But this first step gives us a great starting point for the editing process, and that is where the real magic happens and we can balance out the image and make it truly shine. And we can even fix really badly exposed images. In other genres of photography like architecture or landscape, there's actually much more we can do in the field to deal with really crazy dynamic range differences, but because our subjects are moving in nature photography, we're a lot more limited. When I was photographing high-end real estate for a living, I would use something called exposure bracketing, where you take a series of exposures at different brightness levels and a flashed photo, and then we blended them, giving us maximum dynamic range and a great feel in the overall image, showing the inside and the outside at the same time, something that would be impossible to achieve just in the one photo. But back to nature. Let's look at my favorite tricks that I use to create great balance, great dynamic range, and great details in my images, as well as a beautiful overall look and feel, even when the original exposure may not have been perfect. The first thing I like to do during the raw conversion process is a 3-way or 4-way dance of a few different sliders that will really help you to balance out the light as much as possible and give you a nice and bright image to work with. So I'm here in Lightroom now, and the first thing I like to do is go up here on the right hand side where it's Histogram and click in these 2 corners, because that will now indicate on the image through red or blue areas if these areas are too bright or too dark and losing details. What I want to do is basically stretch the dynamic range in the image as much as possible by brightening it as much as possible with the exposure slider and then bringing all the details in the highlights back with the highlight slider. And you can see that just this move has allowed me to give me a bit more brightness in the background while maintaining actually the same or even better amount of detail. Next, we can play around with the shadows and the white slider a little bit, but I'm more careful with these sliders because they take a lot of contrast out of the image, so I'm only using them in small amounts. In this case, I would just push up the shadow slider a little bit to give me a bit more lightness in the background. And then the whites, we can pull them slightly back to give us a bit more detail on the bird. And depending on your image, you might have to be more aggressive with one slider than the other. For instance, if you're dealing with a black bird, you can probably push the exposure more, push the shadow slider more, and then maybe use the highlight slider a little bit less. The key here is to know that we want to stretch the dynamic range as much as possible. And I like to do that with the exposure and the highlight slider in particular, and then small doses of the shadows and the white slider. Sometimes we will encounter a situation in the field where a certain area on our subject is just too bright to properly work with without having the overall image too dark. So in this case, we can do a fantastic little trick. Instead of just working on the one raw file, we create a copy of our original raw file and then create 2 different exposures of the same raw file. I create one nice and balanced exposure, ignoring the bright wing patch and letting that blow out. And then I create one really dark exposure that brings back all the details in that wing patch. And now for that trick to work with the 2 raw files, we have to go into Photoshop, open both of these raw files in Photoshop, and then grab the dark file and place it on top of our balanced exposure. And then we're going to hide it with a black layer mask by holding down the optional Alt key and clicking the layer mask icon at the bottom. And now that dark layer is hidden and I see my balanced layer again with the too bright wing patch. And to now reveal the detail from the darker image that we've been hiding with the black layer mask, we need to go to the white brush and use it on a low opacity and just brush over the area on the black layer mask where that too bright wing patch is. And now that will reveal the part of the darker layer, allowing me to brush in the darker detail into our balanced exposure and giving us a balanced overall image with a detailed wing patch as well. And if some of these steps and editing in general feels a little bit overwhelming for you, but you're ready to dive in and have fun when it comes to editing your images and want to get to that next level and get beautiful, stunning results, I would recommend that you check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop Masterclasses, where I teach you in great detail and in easy to follow chapters, step by step, how to transform your own images into perfectly looking final photos. But you won't just be watching. I'm also providing you with my own raw files so you can edit right alongside me. And if you're not sure if my classes are worth it or the right fit for you, reading all these amazing reviews from many happy customers might help you make up your mind. So if you want to turn editing from a frustrating chore where you don't really know what sliders to pull and how to get great results into a rewarding experience, then make sure to check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop Masterclasses down there in the description. If you don't want to use Photoshop at all, the trick with the two raw files will not work on Lightroom because you can't stack the images and you have to go into Photoshop to do that. But there's another trick you can do in Lightroom if there's just one area in your raw file that's a little bit too bright. Let's say in this bronze wing image, this white patch on the eye here is just too bright. So what we can do is go over here on the right hand side to the masking panel and then select the objects mask, which gives us a little brush that we can brush over this line, for instance. So if I hold that down, Lightroom will actually create quite a good mask just off that bright area on the bird's face. And then we can go into the highlight slider, for instance, and pull down just that one area and pull back the exposure a bit to give just that little area a bit more detail. So now let me show you a few great tricks that will help us to balance out the overall look and feel of our image. And in particular here on this bronze wing shot, I like to brighten the background and darken down the birds or part of the birds. So all we need to do over here on the right hand side is go to masking panel and then go to select background. And that gives me a pretty accurate selection of the background. And if we don't do crazy changes, this should be sufficient. But in my masterclass, I also teach you a lot more ways to refine the edges of the mask, for instance. So in this case, I would select the background and then I would either go to the exposure slider or the curves. In this case, we can go to the curves and I just pull up the middle bit or lower sort of third of the curve, brightening the background, giving me a bit more of a nice balance because now the brightness of the background and the bird are a lot more similar. And now I want to darken down certain areas of the bird a bit more and also bring in a bit more color of the bird. I could do that by simply selecting the whole bird, going back to the masking panel and go create new mask, select subject, and then that selects my whole subject. But the problem is I might not want to do this on all parts of my subject because if I make a change here now, like lowering the exposure, it lowers it everywhere and it doesn't look quite good. I actually just want to darken certain parts of the perch and the subject. And then there's another cool thing we can do in Lightroom here, and that is intersecting our select subject mask with a brush. And we do that by holding down the Option or Alt key. And then over here on the right hand side, the Add and Subtract will change to Intersect. And now if we hold down the Option Alt key, click on Intersect and go to Brush, I will now be able to make changes and then only the areas I will brush on within the select subject mask will be affected by that. So the select subject mask will act like a border and then the brush will just brush within that border. So I'm not brushing onto my background. So let's say we want to make the subject a little bit darker. We pull down the highlights, we pull down the exposure a bit. And then I also think I want to make it a bit more colorful. So I'm adding a bit of saturation. And now you can see that is still affecting the whole subject. But if I start brushing now, this will revert back to before I made all the changes, and only way I brush now, these details will come out. So I'm going to high flow on my brush, probably 70%. And now I'm just going to brush on the bird's head a little bit, on the bird's neck, and definitely on the bird's back and a little bit over the bird's wing. And we also definitely want to darken down some of the areas here on that perch. And then if we click that on and off now, we can see we've just darkened down certain areas without, for instance, darkening down the chest that doesn't need to be any darker. And that's a fantastic way to work in Lightroom just on specific areas of your subject. And for all of you that are like me that love using Photoshop as well, I show you how I balance out the images here with curves. So the first step in this bronze wing image again would be to brighten the background. And we can do that simply by going to the bottom here to go to select subject. Now we have a good selection of our subject, but actually we want to brighten the background, so we need to invert this mask. So we can either click right, select inverse, which is probably the easiest, or we can also click Control Shift and I or Command Shift and I to invert our selection. And then I go over here on the right hand side where it says adjustments and go to curve adjustments layer. And now that adjustment layer will have opened on the right hand side with the mask. So all changes we make will now only affect the background and not our subject. And then I can just play around with the curve, giving me a good brightness in the image. One advantage of using Photoshop is that we can be quite aggressive with our changes, or if there's areas that are not perfectly selected, it's very easy to make the transition between the bird and the background quite good. In Lightroom, this is a little bit more tricky and needs a bit more tweaking, and you may still end up with more harsh looking edges and harsher transitions than you can get in Photoshop. So a very good example of this would be the bit of the bird's tail here that hasn't been selected. And what we can do in Photoshop is simply go to our brush. Because we have a white layer mask with a black selection hiding the changes on the bird, we use a white brush. 30% opacity, 0% hardness. And now I can just brush part of the bright background also onto the bird wherever there's a transition that doesn't look quite right, like on these fine feathers down here, for instance. And by brushing a little bit of the bright background onto the bird, I basically get the perfect transition between the background every single time without any weird transitions showing at all. So now we've brightened the background, but I still would like to balance out the image a bit more, and I do that with 2 more curves layers. So I go back to the adjustments, create 1 curve layer that I pull up the upper third, and then I press Command or Control I to invert the mask and hide that layer completely. And then I create another curves layer and pull it down on the upper third and press Command or Control I again and hide that layer again under black layer mask. So next I'm going to click select subject again to get a mask of our subject. And what we can do now is to use a white brush and brush on the black layer mask. The black layer mask means everything on that layer is hidden, but if we brush on it with a white brush, it will start to shine through. So I'm selecting my subject so that I'm not brushing onto the background. And then I'm using my white brush again at a 30% opacity. And now I can brush in, for instance, on that layer where we darken things, just in certain areas of the bird and the perch. And that allows me to darken these areas very nicely. And then there might also be some areas that are too dark, like the bird's eye. So I can use the other mask and brush over certain areas on the wing and the tail to make those stand out a little bit more. And that 1-2 punch of a darkening curve layer and a lightening curve layer in combination with a layer that either darkens or brightens the background gives me all the tools I need to perfectly balance out that image in Photoshop and give me that perfect exposure that I wasn't able to achieve in the field. And you can see just by looking at these small changes now that the image actually looks a lot more sort of 3-dimensional, and there's nice detail on the bird while also having a good balance in the image. And from here, I just make a few more tweaks like my normal workflow, levels, curves, bit of hue saturation, and that will give me a fantastic looking final image. As you can see, getting that perfect exposure is actually a mix of different tools. The first step is to get a good balanced exposure in the field. And then the next step is the editing process where we actually tweak that exposure, balance out the image and give it a nice overall look and feel, and also maximize the dynamic range and details in that final image. What I like to do in particular is to work on the bird or parts of the bird and the background or parts of the background individually. And by doing that through masking in Photoshop and Lightroom, I'm able to create a completely different feel in the image than what I've sometimes gotten in the field. In the bronze wing image in particular, I think this was very important because the bird was simply too bright and the background was simply too dark, giving us a very unbalanced looking image. But with the few tweaks that we did and more tweaks that I show you in my masterclasses, we can balance out the image perfectly and actually make the bird shine and get a beautiful overall image. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different take on exposure and that these new perspective and tricks will help you to achieve amazing looking images yourself. And if you do, please share them with me. And I'm also looking forward to hearing all your thoughts about the perfect exposure down there in the comment section. And before you leave, please hit that like button, check out my channel membership, my masterclasses, and hit that subscribe button. And I will see you in another video very soon. Bye.